The next defense against e4 that we're going to look at is called the Sicilian. So white plays pawn to e4, and black responds with pawn to c5, which signifies the Sicilian defense. This defense goes all the way back to the 1500s and is still one of the most popular first moves for black. The c5 pawn attacks this d4 square, so if white advances to d4, he can capture, and of course the queen can recapture, but he's traded a more valuable center pawn for a wing pawn. Most Sicilians continue with white playing knight to f3, and now black has a variety of second moves that he can make. The most popular one is pawn to d6, which defends this e5 square, which will allow the black knight to come to f6 without being harassed by pawn to e5. Black can also play for a second move. He can play knight to c6, supporting the d4 square. So if he pushes and the pawn takes, then they could actually trade knights off. And he can play pawn to e6 in preparation for d5, attacking the center with d5. And he can even play pawn to g6, which will bring the bishop to the g7 square, having center influence along this long diagonal. The most common third move for white would be pawn to d4. Let's say black plays d6, and then white responds with d4, pawn takes, knight takes, and any variation along these lines is called the open Sicilian. The main strategic differences between the white and black side is that black has the two central pawns, so he has a central pawn majority, and he also has this half-open c-file where he can try and line up his rook and queen and attack down this file. And white has a lead in development because he already has his knight out, and he has extra kingside space. He's already attacking this f5 square with his knight and pawn, so he can try for a kingside attack as a result. And black will be going for a queenside attack. If you don't already know, when a player goes on a queenside attack, his goal is to try and win material over there or get a force majority, and then later go after the opponent's king. And in the meantime, he's going to have to stop his opponent's kingside assault. There are many sub-variations of the Sicilian defense, so let's look at a few of them. So after the move pawn to e4, pawn to c5, there are various ways that black can proceed, and each of those ways has a name. So let's look at the Najdorf defense, which is characterized by knight to f3. I'll show you when the Najdorf begins, because these first few moves are similar to many of the Sicilian openings. Knight attacks this pawn. The knight defends, pawn takes, knight takes, and this pawn to a6 move signifies the Najdorf defense. Or if instead of black playing pawn to a6, he instead plays knight to c6, and then white proceeds with bishop to g5, and then black plays pawn to e6, this is known as the Richter-Rauser variation. Or if after, let's back up here, or if after knight to c6, white instead plays bishop to c4 and then e6, this is known as the Sozin variation. Notice how in all of these variations, this pawn structure by black can be formed. And these pawns support and defend all of these squares here on the 5th rank. But because this pawn is not defended by other pawns, it's a bit weak, and white often tries to go after it. But these are very complex positions, and this pawn can be pushed. At some point, this pawn. But the similar features still exist here. Black has the central pawn majority, and this half-open c-file where he'll try and put his rooks, and white has the extra kingside space and he'll go on the kingside attack. But sometimes the players will both play up the center depending on how each player decides to move. Another variation of the Sicilian, which is a big departure from these previous variations, forms a different center pawn formation. It's called the dragon, and it starts out very similarly here with pawn to e4, pawn to c5, knight to f3, and now here's the big departure, pawn to g6, where black is going to put his bishop on g7, affecting this long diagonal and having center influence here. So let's continue with this game and see how it panned out and see if we can make sense of the moves. So in the same way, white attacks, brings his pawn up the center, d4, bishop to g7, development, hitting the center. They still need to castle. Pawn takes, knight takes, knight to c6. Now we have two attackers on this knight and only one defender, so he can capture or run. Let's see what he does. Or defend, right? Those are always your 3 or 4 options when under attack. With development. Knight develops, attacking this pawn. Bishop develops to c4, hitting the f7 pawn. And now both sides are ready to castle. Pawn to d6, pawn to h3, preventing this bishop from attacking the queen. Among other reasons for these moves, we'll just look at the most obvious reasons. Black castles. The bishop backs off because he was undefended, and black can gain a tempo when he attacks it. He could have come here and attacked the bishop, and then he'd have to decide what to do. So instead, he just backs off. Now he's defended. The knight goes after that bishop anyway, because generally, if the position opens up, this bishop pair can become very active. And white castles. Black plays pawn to b6, allowing the bishop to develop along this diagonal. The rook slides over, developing. Bishop to b7, now attacking this pawn again. So there are two attackers on this pawn, the knight and bishop, and only one defender. So the bishop slides to g5, attacking the knight, and also allowing the rook to defend this pawn. So now it's defended twice. The rook develops to the half-open file. As we mentioned earlier, one of the strategies in this opening. And now white plays the bishop to d5. Let's see if we can figure out any logic to this move. Well, he's removed the bishop as a target here for this knight, and maybe he's hoping that the bishops will trade off, or he's allowing this knight to take the bishop, in which case either the pawn or the knight would recapture. Yeah, probably hoping for this sequence, maybe knight takes and pawn takes, and then this pawn, which is backward, would be weak. And so maybe he'd go after that. This rook would be activated this way. So anyway, that's my superficial guess as to why he went this way with the bishop. And the bishop backs off. He doesn't want to go down that path. And now the knight slides over, attacking this undefended pawn. Bishop takes. Knight takes, attacking the pawn again. And black throws in an in-between move, the rock, paper, scissors, attacking the bishop, which is more important than this pawn. And now white looks like he's embarking on some major strategical idea here. He sacrifices the bishop for a pawn. It better work out for him, otherwise he's going to be down material, and that's one of the most important advantages. So pawn takes bishop. He gets this pawn. Okay, attacking the rook. So, 3 pawns is generally worth 1 piece. So, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 5. If he can win 1 more pawn, see this pawn is weak, then he might have a balance of power again. And maybe he's thought this through up to a point, or maybe it's speculative. And then he also has 3 against 2 over here, maybe the possible passed pawns. So this kind of looks like what White was aiming for, which is a very advanced strategic idea. So it looks like because he's up a piece, your basic strategy is to trade off pieces and go into an endgame where you can push a pawn to become a queen. So black is just going all out now to try and trade off pieces, it looks like. Actually even gives him the rook in the process. So he takes the rook, queen takes, pawn chases the knight away, knight redeploys over here. The queen slides up, uniting the rooks, gets the queen off of this open file so it can't be attacked by the rook, and allows one of the rooks to try and take the open file. Knight slides over, maybe aiming to attack the queen. Rook grabs the open file. Pawn pushes the bishop. Bishop slides back. Queen over, defending both pawns. And rook slides over, attacking this pawn. So white, it looks like that's what this strategy was all about. White's going to go after this pawn. Pawn opens up maybe to give the knight an out here. Rooks unite on this open file, which are very powerful. Can challenge the queen at some point. Now the knight attacks the queen, and white decides to capture the knight. Pawn takes. And pawn slides up, defending this pawn and also preventing this pawn from breaking up this pawn structure over here, because he does have his rook and knight on this square, so he could actually push this pawn. So he stops that idea. Queen slides up, allowing the rook to move along the back rank. Pawn up. Now he's going to try and activate this 3 against 2 majority over here. Now the rook defends the pawn, allowing the queen to move away from the defense of the pawn. Yep, here he goes. That's his main strength now. This is white's main strength. Now the bishop slides over, maybe creating a discovered attack on this rook, a little x-ray here. Queen slides over. So, every time your opponent moves, you have to ask what's the purpose. And, there's usually a logic here. So this knight's undefended. So you just reduce back to the most basic ideas. He's also x-raying this rook if the queen moves. So the knight captures the pawn. It might not have been the best move here for white. Forking the rook and the queen, and winning a pawn in the process. Queen runs, and now the knight slides over again, forking the queen and this rook. And at this point, white resigned. His strategy didn't work out. He no longer has the 3-2 majority. He's going to lose a rook, the exchange for the knight, and now this, there's a lot of pressure here. He could probably not even take the rook. So anyway, white resigned here, and this is one way that the dragon panned out. After the opening, you do your setup, hoping for these major strategic ideas into the middle game and end game. But there's a long path before that can happen, and there's a lot of play that can take place, and there are millions of possible moves into the middle game, and it doesn't always work out, right? One player outplays the other player on their path to realizing their big strategic ideas. So there is no ultimate security in knowing the opening well, because the better player almost always wins.